Like every console generation from the beginning, the 5th gen had owners of each machine arguing which one was best. With the Nintendo 64 MIA for the first few years, the Saturn and PlayStation were often at the center of this debate. Frankly, I couldn't possibly care less about any of that. I just wanted to play the games. While I preferred Sega and its machine, I spent lots of time and money on my PlayStation library at the time. I made sure I played the games I wanted and didn't let platform evangelism dictate my experiences. Despite this stance, there was no doubt at all that some games had differences on certain platforms. Sometimes it was because of something as simple as a preference of controller, and sometimes it was differences in sound and visuals. In round 3 of my Saturn vs PlayStation series, we will be looking at 4 games that were released on both machines, and I'll give you some insight into which version I preferred. I hope you guys enjoy Saturn vs PlayStation Round 3. In late 1996, Core Design and Eidos Interactive released the 3D action adventure Tomb Raider for the Saturn and PlayStation. It had garnered a huge amount of press before launch because it was a fully 3D engine that allowed our heroine, Lara Croft, to go nearly anywhere within the play area. She could run, climb, and jump onto just about everything, and you had to solve puzzles frequently to move deeper into the story. While it started development on the Saturn first, Core Design started on the PlayStation soon thereafter, so the two could be released as close as possible. Sega had an exclusivity window of 3 weeks in the UK, but both versions landed in North America at the same time. Upon their release, I was curious as hell as to just how my supposedly weak at 3D polygon Saturn actually handled it. Comparing the two directly, there are 2 things very clear. 1. The Saturn edition is much darker. Its default brightness and gamma settings are much harsher than the more natural light in the PlayStation game. And 2, the Saturn version has textures that are less detailed in places. Outside of that, the first impressions are pretty damn close. Just look at them side by side. Of course, getting deeper in, you start to notice some more things, and a few of them are quite drastic. In the bigger areas with more complicated geometry, the Saturn game tends to chug more than the PlayStation version. Don't get me wrong, both these games have variable frame rates that go all over the place at times, but the Saturn definitely struggles a tad more. Smaller discrepancies include water that actually moves on the Saturn, and a save icon that reflects the environment on the PlayStation. From my personal playing, it seems the levels are pretty much identical in them both, and the gameplay is easy with both controllers. Even the full motion video cinemas are largely the same. I do give the edge to the PlayStation Tomb Raider overall, however. With a much better screen brightness and smoother overall gameplay, it's the one you want if you have access to them both. Don't think too negatively of it on the Saturn though. It's still quite a good game, and the adventure still has all the puzzles and thrills to keep you entertained. Street Fighter Alpha was one of Capcom's earliest releases in the 5th generation. It was essentially a prequel to Street Fighter II, taking place between it and the first. It was called Street Fighter Zero in Japan, and is the subject of one of the most infamous hatchet jobs the gaming media has ever been a part of. The lead up to the release on the Saturn and PlayStation had been huge. It was a brand new Street Fighter with new gameplay elements that set it apart from the games based on Part 2. There were new fighters, new super combos, new counters, and it promised to be damn near arcade perfect in every way. Upon its release, Die Hard Game Fan, a prominent gaming magazine that covered imports often, reviewed the PlayStation game first due to its Japanese street date being a month earlier. They raved about it, gave it perfect scores across the board, and basically said it was identical to the arcade original. When the Saturn game released a month later, they were there to review that as well, but with a very different tone. First, they didn't use the same 3 guys. with the new reviewer for the Saturn version having a basic problem with alpha in general, which translated to a full point lower score. Then the other two guys go on about the shadows not being blue and the sound being worse in the Saturn game, thus rating it lower. One even suggests that the Saturn shadows aren't blue, wait for it, because the Saturn can't do transparencies. That's right, my Sega-loving brethren, this is the kind of bullshit the Saturn faced in the gaming press back then. First off, if you are going to do a comparative review where you say things like this, at the very least get the same 3 opinions from the same 3 guys. I mean, surely the editor-in-chief had to realize the problem this posed before it was ever published. Second, and I always get a kick out of this, the Saturn actually did have the original blue shadows from the arcade. The Saturn allowed you to switch between the default and upgraded shadows based on the soundtrack you chose, something the review crew at GameFan didn't realize. To make matters worse, the resident alpha expert Nick Rocks claims he needed arcade perfection, yet dings the Saturn sound effects that were pretty much identical to the arcade. It was the PlayStation sound effects that were re-recorded and upgraded. So to be clear, upgraded Saturn shadows are dinged for not being arcade exact, and the PlayStation is applauded for the upgraded sound effects. Allow me to read the 2 statements that make my point. When speaking of the PlayStation version, while on the subject of sound, let me mention that Capcom seems to have re-recorded the samples directly off the original tape rather than lifting them off the arcade board, and the difference in quality definitely shows. And now when speaking of the Saturn version, the Super Combo shadows are not blue. They're sort of blue tinged, so that the colors of the character's costume show through. Perhaps Capcom thought it was an upgrade. To me, it's not the arcade. So to be clear, this dude thought it was the best thing ever that Capcom upgraded the sound in the PlayStation version, but it was a total negative that Capcom upgraded the shadows for the Saturn version. Are you kidding me here? The final piece of this story is just an exclamation point to the absurdity of it all. It is mentioned multiple times that the Saturn version plays better due to the controller, and yet it still gets rated lower. Let that sink in for a minute. These jokers basically told us that blue shadows were more important than gameplay. For my opinion of these 2 games, it's pretty simple. The Saturn version has both the blue shadows and the colored ones previously mentioned, faster load times, different fighters in the opening sequence, and the PlayStation version has better sound effects. Outside of these very few differences, both these games are excellent. They play great, they sound great, and I didn't have any gameplay issues with either controller. Side by side, they represent the platforms as excellent ports, and I'd rate them both extremely close. I enjoy the Saturn's arcade-accurate sound effects, and I think the PlayStation's sound good too. I do like the Saturn's shorter load times, but it isn't like the PlayStation version is unplayable because of a few extra seconds. If you have access to both, get the one that uses your preferred controller, but outside of that, A+ efforts for both games. In mid-1997, Thunder Force 5 was released in Japan for the Sega Saturn. For the first time in the series, polygons were used for the enemies, bosses, and some of the background elements. A port of the Saturn game landed on the PlayStation nearly a year later with a few additions like new cinemas, a time attack mode, and a boss rush. The 2 games are essentially identical at their core. Enemy AI is the same, the stage layouts are nearly identical, and the same weapon systems exist in both. Visually, these 2 games look mostly the same as well. The things that are different do tend to stand out, however. For instance, many of the backgrounds have subtle differences between the 2. On the forest stage, the Saturn uses a mesh pattern to display its light rays, but also uses them in a more pronounced way. On PlayStation, they appear more as part of the 2D backdrop and are much more subtle. On the ruined city area, the Saturn version has an entire layer missing in the PlayStation edition. Both have the burned out buildings of the first layer, but the Saturn has multiple parallaxed layers underneath of that. The PlayStation version also has ever so slightly better textures on the polygon enemies. This isn't noticeable on the smaller guys, but you will see it on the enemies that fill the screen. Another thing I noticed is that while they both play well, I did feel a tad more slowdown on the Saturn game, particularly when larger polygon enemies filled the screen. It isn't anything that affects gameplay, but it's there. Outside of that, in the previously mentioned editions, both versions play well, sound great, and have a very similar visual presentation. There really is no winner here because they are both far more similar than they are different. Truthfully, both of them pale in comparison to the previous game in the series when it comes to graphics. Thunder Force 4 didn't have a polygon in sight, but still looked tons better and had a more convincing sense of depth. Thunder Force 5 can still be a good play, however. The soundtrack is especially good, and the weapon system is quite fun to mess around with. It's also an easy game on the lower settings, giving newbies and those of us with less than stellar shoot-'em-up skills a fighting chance. If I had to recommend one over the other, I'd give the edge to the PlayStation version for its extra content and the fact it has a US release, something the Saturn never received. If those extras don't mean much to you, however, you will largely have the same experience with them both, and I recommend you grab whichever one you can get for the cheapest. Rayman was a 2D action platformer that was released in 1995 for a variety of platforms. The gameplay on this one was mainly getting from point A to point B, but it does have some exploration aspects, and there are stages that allow you to use items to mix things up. It was a lush, gorgeous game visually, with multiple background layers, great color, and animation well beyond most of the stuff we saw on 16-bit systems. The Saturn and PlayStation versions were released fairly close together in North America, and I was quite eager to see how they both compared to one another. Popping them in, wow, do they still look great. It is truly amazing how well 2D art holds up all these years later. Both games exhibit beautiful backgrounds and impeccable animations right from the opening stage. They are very nearly identical, but there are some differences worth mentioning. Once you get a few stages in, you'll notice that the PlayStation game has a few touches in the background the Saturn doesn't have. On the third area, there are little clouds of transparent mist the Saturn version lacks entirely, and as you get deeper in the game, some backgrounds are radically different altogether. The stages remain the same in terms of content, but they can take on some very different looks from one another. Another thing that is different are the stage transitions that exist on the Saturn version. Every time you beat a stage, you are treated to the screen being twisted, shrunk, and manipulated in all sorts of different ways. This is completely absent from the PlayStation version. Luckily for us, both remain extremely well-designed games that never fail to look and sound great. While there are a few instances of discrepancy, you will never look at either game and say it looks poor. Both have the same progression of gaining abilities, both have the same stage layouts, and both sound impressive. The only other area that's worth bringing up are the load times, which hover around the 7 to 10 second mark to load a stage. The PlayStation version seems to load a second or two faster, but it's still so close you won't be fussed to care either way. Like many of the multi-platform games that appeared on both, these two games are much more the same than they are different, and you can't go wrong owning either one. I believe the price you get it for and the preference of your controller are far more important than the handful of differences and a couple of backgrounds. This one looks good no matter the platform, so grab whichever one you can get your hands on. That ends round 3 of our Saturn vs. PlayStation episode, and I hope you got a clearer picture of just how close these games were overall. I feel that a big deal is often made about the differences between these two machines, when in fact, the majority of the games often looked and played extremely close to one another. It is true that there are some games out there that really suffered when being brought from one platform to another, but in libraries that numbered in the thousands, this was often the exception and not the rule. Most of the time, multi-platform games were quite comparable between the two, and just as often played just as well. There were always differences of some kind to be sure, but again, these differences served more as curiosities rather than any real reason to choose one platform over another. You could have owned all 4 of these titles I covered in this episode for either platform and not really missed a thing. They all looked, played, and sounded so similar, a casual inspection would be hard-pressed to tell them apart. Round 4 will likely feature some games that are easier to tell apart, but I wanted this episode to really reflect the fact that many games on the 2 platforms were quite solid and well worth owning. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.